Hello everyone, I am Chandana Alavattage. Welcome to my dissertation and research methods lecture on survey methods. The broad aim of this lecture is to provide you with an essential understanding of the survey research methodology. This lecture will provide you with the basis upon which you can think about your dissertation project as a survey research. However, I should emphasize that this lecture will provide you only with a fundamental or essential understanding of this particular research methodology. Therefore, it is very important for you to read the recommended readings for this particular topic. Also, it is very important for you to read a few journal papers which use survey as their research methodology. Together with the fundamental insight that you will gain from this particular lecture, such journal papers would provide a better insight as to how you can carry out a survey research. So, as an intended learning outcome, after following this lecture, and most importantly, after reading the recommended readings for this particular topic, and after going through a few sample papers that use survey method, you should be in a position to design your dissertation project as a survey. So that is what we expect to achieve from this lecture and the supplementary readings. Now, let us begin by asking the most basic question. What is a survey? In a broader sense, we can define or we can understand survey as a research methodology by concentrating on three key points. The first key point about a survey is that a survey is an investigation or an examination carried out by asking a set of questions from a set of people associated with the particular research problem that you want to explore and understand. In other words, you have a particular research problem to explore and to understand. And then there is a set of people associated with that particular research problem. So you want to explore and understand this particular research problem by asking a set of questions from the set of people associated with that particular research problem. However, there's a defining feature regarding a survey. That is, you always ask the same set of questions from everyone subject to your study. Everyone subject to your study answer the same set of questions. Now this is different from, for example, an ethnography or an unstructured interview-based study. In an ethnography or an unstructured interview-based study, you would ask different questions from your interviewees depending on their specific circumstances. But in a survey, you would ask the same set of questions from everyone subject to your study. That is the first key point about a survey. The second key point about a survey is that by asking that set of questions, you can collect both objective data and subjective data. You can ask a set of questions from respondents relating to, for example, their age, gender, income level, ethnicity, nationality, occupation, residential status, marital status, qualifications, and so on. Answers to such questions would provide you more or less objective factual data. At the same time, you can also ask a set of questions from your respondents that would reveal their subjective opinions, attitudes, experiences, intentions, expectations, values, beliefs, and so on. So such data would be rather subjective. So the second key point is that in a survey study, you can collect both the objective and subjective data. The third key point about a survey is that a survey is essentially a sample-based study. The total number of people associated with your particular research problem is called the population, which is the totality. Most of the time, the total number of people associated with your research problem or the population is unknown or too big to reach. Therefore, most of the time, carrying out a total population study, which is often called a census, is impossible or too costly or too time consuming. Therefore, rather than carrying out a census or rather than carrying out a total population study, you would only select a limited number of people who represent that population or that totality. So you would ask your set of questions from this limited number of people or the sample. So a survey is a sample-based study. That is the third key point. Now putting them together, we can summarize a survey is a sample-based study where you explore your particular research problem by asking the same set of questions from a set of people related to your research problem. That is our initial understanding about survey as a research methodology. Now, let us move to our next question. Under what conditions a survey would become an appropriate research methodology? In a very generic sense, the appropriateness of any research methodology depends on the specific nature of the reality or the reality problem or the research problem that you try to explore and understand. When it comes to survey method, as we already discussed, we try to explore and understand a particular reality situation, a reality condition, or a research problem by asking a set of questions from a set of people associated with that reality condition. Therefore, the survey method will become an appropriate methodology when those set of people, by answering our set of questions, can reliably and validly reveal the reality to us, to the researcher. In other words, the manner in which those social actors from whom we ask those questions perceive and understand and explain the reality to us provide a useful, reliable, and valid manifestation of the reality itself. So that is the generic condition under which a survey method would become an appropriate research methodology. If I want to be more specific, then I can think of certain specific conditions under which the survey method would become appropriate. First, when your research question demands you to profile or to construct a profile of the subjective and objective differences or similarities of the people associated with your research problem, survey method would become appropriate. So you need to develop a profile. You want to profile the manner in which the people become different or similar. So you can do a survey to construct such a profile of the respondents, of the people associated with the research problem. Secondly, when your research problem demands you to classify people associated with your particular research problem into different categories based on their objective or subjective characteristics, then a survey method would become appropriate. So you want to construct a categorical classification. Thirdly, when you want to understand how people perceive and react differently to a particular research issue, then you can use a survey research. So there, your idea is to understand or develop a description of how people perceive and react differently. And fourthly, a survey method would become appropriate when you want to understand how people's subjective and objective differences lead to, contributes to certain performance or behavioral outcomes. For example, you understand that you can observe that there are clear differences in the manner in which people perform and people achieve certain performance targets, performance objectives. So you want to know whether people's objective and subjective differences, characteristic differences, opinion, attitude, and so on, would contribute to these outcome differences, in which case you can use a survey research. So those are some example specific conditions under which a survey method would become appropriate. Survey-based studies can take two different forms. First one is descriptive surveys. Second one is analytical or inferential surveys. We can differentiate between these two forms of surveys on the basis of three key dimensions. The first one is the nature of the research questions and the nature of the research aims that you would be setting for your research project. Second dimension, according to which you can differentiate between these two forms, is the nature of the survey questions that you would be asking. And the third dimension, according to which you can differentiate between these two forms, is the mode of analysis. So we can use these three dimensions to differentiate between two forms of survey studies. Now, when it comes to the first dimension, the research questions means the broader questions that you are asking regarding the particular reality that you want to explore. The research question is the reality question. That is the basic or the bigger question that you want to answer through your survey. In the case of a descriptive survey, predominantly you would set your research questions in the form of what questions, descriptive questions, with the aim of describing the reality situation, with the aim of profiling the reality situation. Sometimes you may ask why questions, but even in that case, your aim is to provide a description or a profile of the particular reality at a particular time. So that is the nature of the question and the nature of the research aims that you would set in the case of a descriptive survey, because your aim is to describe, to provide a profile. But on the other hand, when it comes to the analytical or inferential survey, you would predominantly ask why and how questions, with the aim of analyzing and inferring possible causalities and association between variables, between independent and dependent variables. So your aim is mainly to test and explain why and how a particular reality is produced and reproduced. So that is the manner in which you would think about your research questions and aims in the case of an analytical survey. Now, when it comes to our second dimension, the manner in which you form your survey questions. Now, survey questions are not the research questions. Research question is the broader, bigger questions that you ask about the reality. And those are the bigger questions that you are going to answer by analyzing the survey questions. Survey questions are the series or a set of questions that you would ask from your respondents. And by analyzing that series of questions, you would answer your research question. So when it comes to the descriptive surveys, your survey questions are formed, or in other words, your questionnaire is formed or developed or conceptualized to capture different dimensions according to which the reality is to be profiled, according to which the reality is to be described. So your purpose is to describe the reality, and you understand the reality can be described and reality has to be described in multiple dimensions. So you have a series of questions to capture each of these multiple dimensions. And you would have a description of the reality in line with those multiple dimensions. So that is the way you form your questionnaire in the case of a descriptive survey. But when it comes to an analytical survey, you conceptualize, you design your questionnaire, the series of questions, to operationalize a set of variables. You form a set of questions through which you can measure a particular dependent or independent variables. The questionnaires or the set of questions that you ask is to measure a given variable. And that variable is conceptualized through that set of questions. And your aim is to measure those variables and then to test whether there is a causality and association between these variables. So that's how you design your questionnaire in the case of analytical surveys to operationalize your variables. And when it comes to the third dimension, the mode of analysis, which means what sort of analysis, what sort of statistics that you would be using in your analysis. In the case of descriptive surveys, you would predominantly use descriptive statistics and various sort of data visualization techniques, because your aim is to describe. You would use the mean values, frequencies, bar charts, pie charts, and so on to explain or to describe the particular reality situation. So you would construct a profile of the reality through descriptive statistics. But when it comes to analytical surveys, your aim is to test the possible causalities and association between variables. So you would be using predominantly inferential statistics. And you would be testing a set of hypotheses under relevant probabilities. So that is the sort of analysis that you would carry out in the case of an analytical or inferential survey. So that is the difference between these two forms of surveys. So to summarize, a survey can take either a descriptive or an analytical form. You can differentiate between these two forms on the basis of the manner in which you ask your research question and set your research aim, and the manner in which you form your survey questionnaire, and the nature of the analysis that you would carry out. There's one important point to emphasize here. These two forms of survey studies are not mutually exclusive. They are somewhat overlapping. In the case of descriptive statistics, you still may have certain elements of inferential statistics. And more importantly, especially in the case of analytical surveys, you will have a good deal of descriptive statistics to be used. Because before you try to analyze and test a hypothesis regarding the association or the causality between dependent and independent variables, you need to describe the reality using descriptive statistics. So, these two forms of surveys are not mutually exclusive. They are somewhat overlapping. Now, we are moving to more pragmatic or procedural aspects of doing a survey-based study. Here, my concentration will be on analytical surveys. In this discussion, we will concentrate on the key elements that you have to build, or the key steps that you have to follow in carrying out an analytical survey. So these key elements would include, first, specification and justification of the research problems and aims. As I have already mentioned in my other lectures, the definition of problem or the research problem is the ideal starting point of any good research. Therefore, we would start by talking how you would define and justify your research problem when it comes to an analytical survey. The second key element that we need to discuss is how we translate our research problem and aims into a set of hypotheses, into a hypothesized causality or association between independent and dependent variables. So that is the second element we will be discussing. And the third element that we need to discuss is how we design our survey instrument or questionnaire, how we conceptualize and design the set of questions that we are going to ask from our respondents. That is the third element. And the fourth element that we are going to discuss is how do we test the validity and reliability of our survey instrument or the questionnaire. And as I already mentioned, a survey-based study is a sample study. So therefore, we will be also discussing how should we select our sample and explain our sample and justify our sample. And finally, we will be discussing the analysis or the use of statistics to describe our results and to test hypotheses. There we will be discussing the manner in which we can use descriptive statistics and inferential statistics in carrying out our analysis. So those are the key elements that we need to have in our analytical survey. We will be discussing and explaining these key elements with the help of a sample journal paper. We will see how the authors of that sample journal paper have built each of these elements in their research paper. Defining your research problem. That would be the first step of your research project. As I mentioned in all my other lectures in this course, the definition of research problem and clarification of your research aims is the ideal starting point of a good research, irrespective of the methodology that you would follow. There should be a clear connection between the methodology that you are going to follow and the manner in which you are defining your research problem. The definition of research problem is an important task or element because that will provide the basis upon which everything else in your research project would be decided. Therefore, you need to pay special attention to the manner in which you define your research problem and you justify your research problem. Now, when it comes to survey research, as I already mentioned, your research problem or the reality situation that you are going to explore is something that you can explore through the opinions, experiences, and attitudes of the people from whom you are asking the questions. Therefore, you have to define your research problem in a manner that spell out the people's experience, opinions, and attitudes constitute part of your reality problem or the research problem. In other words, you define your research problem in such a manner that the people's opinion, experiences, and attitudes is a fundamental element of the reality that you are talking about or the research problem that you are trying to answer. Now, to explain this particular point better, let us take a couple of examples. The first example paper that I want to discuss here is a paper by Linda Thorne and her colleagues. Motivations for issuing standalone CSR reports, a survey of Canadian firms. This is a paper published in one of the well-reputed accounting journal, Accounting, Auditing and Accountability Journal. And if you go through the research aims or the research questions, you will understand this particular paper is a descriptive survey. That is because these authors ask what type of questions or the descriptive questions, and they carry out a descriptive analysis, and they describe or profile the status quo. Now in this paper, Linda and her colleagues basically ask three questions, or they set three main aims. The first one is they want to know why do Canadian firms either publish or do not publish standalone CSR reports. That means they want to know the motivations behind the publication of CSR reports. And they also want to know what are the possible costs involved in the publishing standalone CSR reports. And thirdly, they also want to know the extent to which these companies follow the Global Reporting Initiative or the GRI guidelines. And you will easily understand all these questions or all these aims are descriptive questions or descriptive aims. And they will lead the authors to provide a descriptive analysis. And ultimately the paper will provide a profile or a description of the status quo. Why some firms publish standalone reports and why some others do not. What are the factors or what are the motivations behind such decisions? And also the extent to which, if they publish a standalone report, the extent to which they would follow the GRI guidelines. And these type of questions can easily be answered by asking a series of survey questions from the relevant people in relevant companies which either publish or do not publish standalone CSR reports. So these questions are quite appropriate and well tuned towards a descriptive survey. So please go through this paper and see how these authors contextualize their research questions and aims, how they explain their research questions and aims, and how they justify their research questions and aims. And especially go through the paper and see how they draw upon the existing literature in order to contextualize and justify their research aims and questions. So that's a very important key point. When you are specifying, when you are explaining your research problems and research aims, you need to contextualize and justify your research aims and problems drawing upon existing literature by connecting them to a debate or a research trajectory in the existing literature. The second paper to which I am going to direct you is a paper by Priyanka Groen and her colleagues. Employee Participation, Performance Metrics and Job Performance. A survey study based on self-determination theory. So that is the title of the paper. And this paper was published in Management Accounting Research, one of the well-reputed accounting journals. As you will understand, this paper is an analytical survey. In contrast to descriptive surveys that we just discussed in our previous example, now in the case of an analytical survey, as in the case of this example paper, the reality situation or the reality problem is to be conceptualized as a causality or association between variables, dependent and independent variables. So accordingly, in this example paper, these authors want to see whether there is a connection or a causality between job performance and the extent to which employees participate in the development of their own performance metrics. So those are the two key variables that they want to see whether there is an association or causality between job performance, the dependent variable, and the extent to which employees participate in the development of their own performance metrics, the independent variable. And they also want to see whether this connection between job performance and employee participation is mediated by two other key variables. One is the quality of the performance matrix that they develop and the manner in which performance matrix is used by the managers. So overall, they have four key variables and they want to see whether there is a particular association between these four key variables. That is how they explain and understand their research problem and the research aims, to see and to test this association or this causality. Now yet again, when you go through this particular paper, see how they draw upon the existing literature to explain and justify and to contextualize their research problems and aims. That is a very important element when you are writing your dissertation or thesis. So you need to justify and you need to explain and you need to contextualize your research problems and aim within the existing literature by drawing upon the existing literature. Once you specify your research problems and your research aims, you need to translate them into a specific set of concepts, themes, variables, and hypotheses, depending on whether you are trying to do a descriptive survey or an analytical survey. As we already discussed, in the case of a descriptive survey, your purpose is to describe or to develop a profile about the reality. And you would not conceptualize the reality as association or a causality between dependent and independent variables. Instead, you would be thinking about the reality as a composition of a particular set of themes or particular set of concepts. It is a composition of a particular set of concepts and themes. So therefore, you have to identify a specific set of themes and concepts according to which you would describe or you would develop a profile about the reality. And that set of concepts or themes would provide you the conceptual framework according to which you would design your questionnaire. So you will have a specific set of questions for each concept or each theme. And you would explore each concept or each theme asking a specific set of questions. And then you can explain and describe the reality in line with the answers you got for those questions. So that is the role that themes and concepts would play in designing your survey, a descriptive survey. Now, for example, if we go back to our example paper, Linda and her colleagues' paper, which is a descriptive survey. They wanted to study why Canadian firms either publish or do not publish standalone CSR reports. And they organize that survey, that descriptive survey, in line with a few specific themes or concepts. So, when you go through the paper, you will easily understand. The first theme or concept is the reasons or the motivations. They want to explore the reasons or the motivations for issuing or not issuing standalone CSR reports. And they will have a set of questions to explore the reasons or the motivations behind such decisions. And then they also want to see whether a specific set of factors underlie such decisions. The second theme or second dimension that they want to use in describing the reality is the factors. So they have a set of questions to see a specific set of factors underlie such decisions. And then third dimension, according to which they want to describe the reality, is the possible benefits. What are the possible benefits that they perceive and how they underlie their decision? And also they want to see the negative repercussions, whether a particular set of possible negative repercussions matters for these particular companies in making their decision either to publish or not to publish standalone CSR reports. And they also want to see, in the case of those companies who are not publishing standalone CSR reports, whether there is a likelihood that they would publish in the future. So those are the key dimensions or key themes according to which they organize their descriptive survey. And then they describe or develop a profile about the reality in line with these dimensions or themes. So as you understand, if you are doing a descriptive survey, it is very important to identify and explain a specific set of dimensions or themes according to which you would organize your survey. And that set of dimensions would provide you the conceptual framework. Then, if you are doing an analytical survey, as we already discussed, you conceptualize your reality as an association or a causality between independent and dependent variables. Therefore, it is very important to translate your research problem and aims into a specific set of variables and hypotheses. And you would establish your knowledge claim by testing those hypotheses. And those variables and hypotheses provide the conceptual framework according to which you would carry out your analytical survey. Now, in the case of our example paper, Bianca and her colleagues' paper, so as you would remember, they want to explore whether there is a causality between the employee performance, the dependent variable, and the extent to which employees participate in the development of their own performance evaluation metrics, mediated by two other variables: the quality of the metrics and the manner in which the metrics is being used. So those are the relationship or the causalities they want to establish. So because they have very well specified that research problem and aims, so the specific set of variables and the hypotheses that they want to establish for their study is already clear. So they have 4 key variables. And they have, accordingly, a set of hypotheses to test the relationship between these variables. So they have a first variable, PM, or the performance matrix participation, another variable, performance matrix quality, and another variable, use of performance metrics, the manner in which they are being used by the managers. Then they understand there are 3 different ways a performance metrics can be used depending on according to the existing literature. And then finally, they are big dependent variable, employee job performance. So this is the manner in which they conceptualize their analytical survey, the variables and the causalities. So accordingly, they will have a set of questions to conceptualize and to measure the performance metrics participation. And in their questionnaire, they will also have a set of questions to conceptualize and measure the performance metrics quality. And they will also have a set of specific questions in their questionnaire to conceptualize and to measure the manner in which the performance metrics is used by the managers. And finally, they will also have a set of questions to conceptualize and measure the employee job performance. So you will understand it is very important to have a clear translation of your research problem and aims into a specific set of variables and hypotheses. And the questionnaire is designed to conceptualize and measure those variables. And through that measurement, you can test your hypotheses. So therefore, you have to pay special attention, take your time, okay, and think carefully about how do you define your variables, how do you measure your variables. And that provides the conceptual basis upon which you design your questionnaire, the survey instrument, in the case of an analytical survey. So I would ask you, please go through these example papers to see how they operationalize their survey. That will help you, guide you to think about your own research questions, to think about how you can translate your own research question into a specific set of concepts, dimensions, variables, and hypotheses depending on whether you are doing a descriptive survey or an analytical survey. The third element or the step of doing a survey study is designing your survey instrument or the questionnaire. Perhaps that is the most important element of doing a survey. If you have followed the first 2 steps that we discussed so far very well, then you are in a better position to design your questionnaire. That means if you have a clear set of research questions and aims, and if you have translated them into a specific set of concepts, themes, variables, and hypotheses, you have a conceptual framework according to which you can think of your questionnaire. Now, when it comes to a descriptive survey, as we already mentioned, your aim is to describe or to develop a profile. So, the specific questions that you would ask from your respondents, in other words, the specific elements that you would include in your questionnaire would be directed to ascertain the status quo, to ascertain and describe what is going on, what these people think about a particular concept or a theme or a factor. Accordingly, you formulate your questionnaire. You formulate individual items in that questionnaire to ascertain the status quo. So when you are trying to do that, you can determine either the importance of something or the agreement of your respondent about a particular statement, or you can ascertain the status of the reality, or you can ascertain the likelihood. So your questions can be designed to ascertain either the importance, agreement, checking the status, or checking the likelihood. For example, as in the case of Linda and her colleagues' paper, you can formulate a set of questions to see the importance that your respondent attribute to a particular factor or particular theme or a particular concept. So you would ask whether a particular item is very important, somewhat important, or not important at all. So you provide a particular conceptual framework to answer that question in terms of the importance. So this kind of a scaling of the answer is called Likert scale. So most of the descriptive as well as analytical surveys heavily use this sort of Likert scales. So the answer is framed within a particular scale. So the respondents have to answer in that scale. That will make your analysis easier. So that's the first thing. You can check whether a particular item is important or not. So the one dimension of reality, or one dimension according to which you would profile and describe the reality, is the importance that your respondents attribute to a particular set of factors. Similarly, you can formulate your research questionnaire, individual items, in order to ascertain the agreement of your respondents regarding a particular claim or assertion. So you describe the reality in a particular manner. You say, reality is this, do you agree? So the respondents would say, yes, I strongly agree. Or at the other end, they would say, no, I would strongly disagree. So you can ascertain the agreement. And thirdly, the reality might be simply a situation of whether a particular condition or a factor is present or absent. So you would ask therefore a question, yes or no, accept or do not accept, present or absent. So that's the third type of questions you can formulate, because if you think the reality is manifested by the fact that a particular condition or a factor is absent or present, ask the question accordingly. Or, as Linda and her colleagues use in this particular sample paper, you can also ask the question to check the likelihood of something, whether there's a possibility of something happening. So those are the manners in which you can formulate your research questions in your questionnaire. So this paper by Linda and her colleagues provide a good set of examples as to how you may formulate your research questions to check either the importance, the agreement, the status, or the likelihood. So please go through that paper and see how that paper would be helpful for you to think about your own survey design. Now, when it comes to an analytical survey, at the very outset, the questionnaire that you are going to design would not be that different from a questionnaire designed for a descriptive survey. The individual questionnaire items would look like very similar. You still will have specific sections, and under each specific section you will have a set of questions. So you will have a specific variable. For that particular variable, you will have a specific questionnaire items, a number of questionnaire items. And these questionnaire items would look like very similar to a descriptive survey. They will still have a Likert scale. So those specific individual questionnaire items still identify or gather the respondents' responses according to a scale. Something like strongly agree, agree, strongly disagree, and so on. Or highly satisfied, satisfied, highly dissatisfied, and so on. Or your questionnaire may have even items which tells you a binomial condition. Yes, no, present, absent, and so on. So therefore, at the outset, when you look at this questionnaire, both the descriptive surveys and analytical survey questionnaires would look like very similar. However, there is a fundamental conceptual difference between these two approaches. As we already discussed, a descriptive survey tried to describe or construct a profile. Therefore, each and every individual question is asked to ascertain the status quo. And the responses you are getting from each and every individual respondents would be an element that constitute a totality. So you aggregate them, you summarize them in order to arrive at certain descriptive statistics such as mean values. And you will use that mean values, totals, and so on to describe the reality, to construct a profile of the reality. Now, when it comes to the analytical surveys, your purpose is not to ascertain the status quo. You design each and every individual questionnaire items in order to measure the variability. That is the key point. So each and every individual items in your questionnaire is directed towards measurement of the variability of the variables. So the responses that you are getting from your respondents represent a particular point on a curve. So the difference between one response and another response is the variation, the variability. So that tells you how your dependent variables would vary in line with independent variables. So your questionnaire would have a certain set of questions for an independent variable. So the respondent A gives you an answer for these questions. So therefore the respondent A would have a certain perception about the value of that particular variable. And similarly, the respondent A would have value attributed to your dependent variable. So when you compare that with the respondent B, so you see a difference. So that says the variability. So what matters for you is not the manner in which you can put them together and calculate a descriptive statistics. What more important for you in the case of an analytical survey is the variation. How the dependent variable changes in line with the changes in the independent variables. So the analytical focus, the manner in which you use your questionnaire item is different. That is to measure the variability so that you can test the causality or the hypothesis association between variables. So such associations between variables or the causality between variables would be your hypothesis. So that is how you think about your survey instrument or your questionnaire in the case of an analytical survey. So to summarize, in the case of a descriptive survey, each and every individual questionnaire items should be conceived or conceptualized as an element of a totality. So you are trying to ascertain the status and you summarize them, aggregate them in order to construct descriptive statistics through which you describe your reality. In the case of analytical surveys, your respondents provide you a measurement of variation. So your attention is on the variables through which you explain and you test the causality or the associations. So that's the fundamental differences of questionnaire design in the case of descriptive surveys and analytical surveys. So yet again, go through this example paper. You can see how they conceptualize their variables through their questionnaire. For example, this Priyanka and her colleagues' paper, they have 4 key variables. For each 4 key variables, they have set of questionnaire items. They do not provide you the detailed questionnaire, but they provide you an outline or elementary view of their questionnaire in the appendix. So have a look at that appendix. You can see how each variable is conceptualized into a specific set of sub-elements or sub-items, and responses to which would represent a measurement of the variable. So go through that paper, you would have a better understanding of what I am trying to explain here. The next step of doing a survey study is to test reliability and validity of your survey instrument or the questionnaire. In a broader sense, reliability means the extent to which the results can be reproduced or repeated when the test or the research is repeated under the same conditions. Now, for example, I have a bathroom scale which I use to measure my weight. So I get onto the bathroom scale and it gives me a value of, say, 75 kilograms. That is the first attempt. Now, without changing anything in my body, I get back to the bathroom scale for the second time. And it gives me 75 kilograms. Again, without changing anything in my body, I get to the bathroom scale third time. It gives me 75 kilograms. So all these repeated attempts under the same condition of my body, it gives me 75 kilograms. That means it is a reliable scale. On the other hand, if it gives me different values for each of these attempts, then that scale is not reliable. So, in a very broader sense, reliability means the extent to which the results can be reproduced when the test or the research is repeated under the same conditions. Testing reliability is not that difficult when it comes to a bathroom scale. But when it comes to social sciences and social science research methods such as survey research, the testing reliability is not that easy because it is very difficult to keep the conditions of test the same. Every time you repeat your test, the conditions might change. So it is not that easy. So there are limitations when you are going to test the reliability in social sciences. Anyway, at least at the conceptual level, how do you test the reliability? By checking the consistency of the results across time, across different observers, and across different parts of the test itself. So you provide the same test to the same person again and again, or you provide the same test to different people and see whether the results are consistent. And you might use one part of a test against another part of the test to see whether the results are consistent. So those are the broader ways of measuring or testing the reliability. And remember, they are not perfect ways of testing reliability, because in social conditions, the conditions would often change. It is almost impossible to have a perfectly good, perfectly correct reliability test. However, most of the survey results would use a pilot test to test reliability as well as the validity. So you would, rather than going straight to the bigger sample, you would use a small element of the sample, a small number of respondents, and see whether they clearly understand your questionnaire, whether they consistently understand the questionnaire, whether they consistently answer the questionnaire in the same manner. So that is, even though not perfect, that is a one popular method of testing reliability in survey research. Validity, on the other hand, means the extent to which your research or your test measures what it supposed to measure. Now, for example, I am using my bathroom scale to measure my body weight. Therefore, to be a valid scale, that bathroom scale should provide me a value of nothing else but the body weight. When it comes to surveys, we know we organize our survey instrument or the questionnaire on the specific set of themes, concepts, and variables. And we would ask a specific set of questions to measure each of these concepts, themes, or variables. For example, in the case of Bianca and her colleagues' paper, they want to measure as their dependent variable the employee job performance. For that purpose, they would ask a specific set of questions from the managers and the employees. So the validity basically means those questions that they ask from those managers and employees should be understood in terms of job performance. And the answers that they are going to get should measure the concept of or the variable called job performance. For example, not job satisfaction. So if it measures the job satisfaction instead of job performance, then it is not a valid measurement, because it does not measure what it expects to measure. In the same manner, Bianca and her colleagues want to measure the extent to which employees participate in the development of performance metrics. So that is one of their independent variables. So in that case also, they ask a set of questions from the employees. And those questions should capture, and those questions should measure nothing else but the notion of participation. So in that sense, the validity basically means whether the specific set of questions that you are asking from the respondents would capture and measure the specific concept, theme, or the variable that you want to measure from that set of questions. That's what you mean by validity in the context of a survey questionnaire. Now, how do you check, how do you test the validity of your survey? One obvious method is getting the help of an expert, or in other words, expert opinion. You can ask an expert in the field to check and tell you whether this particular set of questions would actually measure what you're supposed to measure. Another method is you can compare your results with established theories, whether your results corresponds with the theoretical understanding or theoretical conclusions that you already have in your field. Another method is to compare your results with prior literature. So in this sense, you can have to compare your results with the prior literature, to compare your results with an established theory. You can have a pilot study. So you will run a small pilot study and see how your employees or participants understand your questions and whether the answers that they provided corresponds to the prior literature, established theories, and some expert opinions. So those are the methods through which you can check the validity of your survey instrument. Next step of doing a survey-based study is to select an appropriate sample. As we already discussed, a survey is a sample-based study. Therefore, selecting an appropriate sample is a very fundamental, essential element of doing a survey. Now, when it comes to judge the appropriateness of a sample, there are two key dimensions that we have to take into account. First is the nature of the population that your sample is going to represent. Second element is the nature of the research questions that your sample is going to provide answers for. So those are the two key dimensions, the nature of the population and the nature of the questions. As we already know, a sample is there to represent a population. Therefore, parameters that define your population should be there in your sample. For example, if you think that your population or your totality is a random collection of elements, then your sample can also be a random collection of elements. In other words, you can deploy random sampling. But on the other hand, if you think that your population is not totally random, but it is composed of a specific stratification or a structure, then you have to select your sample to manifest, to represent that structure or stratification. For example, if you understand that your population composed of 50% male and 50% female, then your sample should also composed of 50% male and 50% female. So that is stratified or structured sample. So in a broader sense, your sample should manifest and represent the specific parameters that define the population. That's the first dimension according to which you can judge, you can talk about, or you can explain the appropriateness of your sample. The second dimension according to which you have to explain and discuss the appropriateness of your sample is the nature of the research questions that you are going to answer. Whether your sample can actually answer the questions that you are going to ask. Now, for example, in the case of Bianca and her colleagues' paper, they want to ascertain, they want to measure the extent to which employees participate in the development of performance metrics. So therefore, they have to ask a set of questions from a set of respondents about the extent to which employees participate in the development of their own performance metrics. So in that sense, their sample should include employees because they have to ask those questions from the employees. Because that is the employees who can provide a sensible, meaningful, valid and reliable answers for those questions. So therefore, employees should be part of their sample. In the same manner, so they want to ascertain or they want to measure the job performance of the employee. And in a corporate situation, such job performance are judged and measured by the managers. Therefore, you have to ask a set of questions from the managers. So the managers should be a part of your sample. So therefore, when you are designing your sample, you have to be very careful and think whether the respondents that you include in your sample can effectively, validly and reliably provide answers to the questions that you are going to answer. So that's how you think about your sample. To summarize, when you're thinking about your samples, you have to think about at the same time two dimensions. One is the nature of the population which this sample is going to represent. Second one is the nature of the research questions which this sample is going to answer. So that's how you have to think about the selection of your sample. The final element of doing a survey is the analysis. What I mean by analysis is the manner in which you would use statistics. And as we already discussed, the manner in which you would use statistics depends on the fact that whether you are going to use a descriptive survey or an analytical survey. Now, in the case of a descriptive survey, as we already discussed, your purpose is to provide a description or to construct a profile of the status quo. And you would predominantly use descriptive statistics. For example, mean values, standard deviations, mode, and so on. And also you might use various data visualization techniques such as bar charts, pie charts, and so on to provide a description or to construct a profile of the status quo. Now, for example, if you go through Linda and her colleagues' paper, the descriptive survey, you can easily see how they carry out their analysis. They have statistical or descriptive statistical tables to summarize their results, and they discuss them. And such discussions are organized along the specific set of themes and concepts that you would use in constructing your questionnaire. So in other words, the set of themes and concepts that you have already used in the construction of your questionnaire will be very useful in reporting your results, in discussing your results. Now, when it comes to the discussion and analysis chapter, remember that simply providing the numbers or simply providing the responses that you got from your respondents is not an analysis. It is simply data dumping. So you need, in addition to providing those numbers, in addition to summarizing those numbers in relevant statistical tables and charts and so on, you have to have a discussion. You have to have a kind of interpretation as to what these numbers means. So you have to make a sense of these numbers. How do you do that? Basically by connecting your findings, your results to prior literature and the relevant theories. So that's what you mean by interpreting your numbers. So you calculate the numbers, you present those numbers in appropriate tables and charts, and then you have to discuss them, you have to interpret them in the light of prior literature and the relevant theories. That is what a good data analysis would constitute. And in the case of a descriptive survey, you would use descriptive statistics and a set of concepts and themes to provide that interpretation or analysis. When it comes to an analytical survey, as we already discussed, the purpose is to explain the reality in terms of causality or association between dependent and independent variables. And that explanation is provided by testing a set of hypotheses. Therefore, the key mode of analysis is hypothesis testing. So when it comes to test a set of hypotheses, you need inferential statistics. The key analytical role will be played by inferential statistics. Inferential statistics means those statistical techniques that you can use to test the association or correlation or regression between variables. So you would use either parametric or non-parametric statistics which can test the association, correlation, or the regression. So those are the key statistical techniques you would use. An ultimate aim is to test a given hypothesis under a given probability condition. You have to say finally whether your hypothesis is accepted or rejected, and if it is accepted or rejected, under which probability conditions. That doesn't mean that you are not going to use descriptive statistics at all. You still may use descriptive statistics even in the case of an analytical survey. That is because before you move on to test your hypothesis, you will still have to describe your sample, for example, and you have to describe your results using descriptive statistics. So you would first carry out the description and then move on to test. So therefore, you would use both descriptive and analytical or inferential statistics in the case of an analytical survey. But predominantly, the key analytical role is played by inferential statistics. Now yet again, simply carrying out a test and telling whether a hypothesis is accepted or rejected is not a complete analysis and a discussion. You need to discuss, you need to interpret your results. So what do you mean by the acceptance of this hypothesis? How would that implicate on the existing literature, existing theories, and managerial or policy decisions? So that is also a part of your analysis. So to repeat it again, in the case of analytical surveys, the key analytical role is played by inferential statistics, supported by certain amount of descriptive statistics. Even in the case of analytical survey, you can't simply dump the data. You need to discuss them. You need to interpret them. And your interpretation should be directed towards the existing literature, relevant theories, and the policy or the managerial implications. So that is the analysis in an analytical survey. Now, to summarize what we discussed in this particular lecture, this lecture was about doing a survey. And in a broader sense, a survey can take either descriptive or analytical form. You can have a descriptive survey or an analytical survey. A descriptive survey is driven to provide a description or to construct a profile of the status quo. And you would predominantly use descriptive statistics. And an analytical survey, on the other hand, think about the reality situation as a causality or an association between dependent and independent variables. And your aim is to explain the reality by testing a set of hypotheses relating to the causality or the association between dependent and independent variables. In that case, you would predominantly use inferential statistics. And the key element of your survey study, whether it is a descriptive survey or whether it is an analytical survey, is the questionnaire. The design of the set of questions that you are going to ask from a particular set of people or the respondents or the sample. So when you are designing your questionnaire, you have to carefully think about a specific set of themes, concepts, variables, and hypotheses. And those concepts, themes, variables, and hypotheses provide the conceptual framework according to which you organize your questionnaire, you design your questionnaire, you collect your data, you analyze your data, and you present your data. And when you are thinking about that particular questionnaire, you also have to think about its validity and its reliability. And finally, when it comes to the analysis involves not only the use of statistics, not only the calculation of some numbers, but also interpretation of them in the light of existing literature and relevant theories. So if you want to have further understanding of fundamental concepts related to a survey study, please go through these sample papers that we discussed in this lecture, as well as some other methodology material. For example, one good methodology book could be this one. So this provides a fairly good introductory insight into the key concepts that we discussed in this lecture. So please go through these supplementary materials and the sample paper to have enhanced understanding of what we discussed in this lecture today. I hope this lecture helps you, and thank you very much for listening or watching this lecture. Goodbye.